Farmer Tom here. Welcome to the Farmer Tomcast. Today on our ongoing series, Heroes of the Green, we have Radical Russ Belville. How's it going, Russ?
We're doing great. How you doing, Farmer Tom?
Good, buddy, good. So you want to tell the world your story and your beginnings with cannabis?
Yeah, there's personal and there's professional. I'll start with the personal. I am the son of a recovered drug addict alcoholic. And so growing up, I grew up in the 80s. It was Nancy Reagan. It was just say no. And I was taught that drugs were the worst possible thing in the world. So, I was a pretty clean cut, leave it to beaver kind of guy. And then I eventually graduated high school. I was a professional musician for many years. And as things would happen, I would eventually join a rock and roll band. And one day on a, 4th of July weekend, 1990, we're in the hotel room up there in McCall, Idaho, the resort town, after the gig. And well, one of the long-haired guitar players pulled out one of them there marijuana cigarettes. And I was kind of frightened. It was like, oh no, I'm in a band with guys that do drugs, right? Because still, 1990, we're just coming out of the 80s, but they started passing it around and it got to me and I'm like, oh no thanks. And they're like, oh, okay. And they just kept passing around like, with alcohol. And I'd been drinking since I was 16, since like 1984. With alcohol, it was always like, oh, come on, you got to try it. Be a man, chug, the college thing. But with the pot, it was like, oh, you're not smoking? Great, more for us. And they just kept passing it around. And so, it goes around the circle 3 or 4 times and I'm, not smoking any. And pretty soon, one of the guitar players is kind of giggling and being silly, and the other one's just laughing at him. And I was like, wow, they don't seem to be turning into axe murderers. I mean, this seems like, let me try that, right? And so I tried it. And, there's a lot of people, Tommy, say, I first smoked pot, I didn't feel anything. Not me. It was like the clouds parted, the light came down, the hallelujah chorus rang. Like, where have you been all my life? And why have I been drinking? Like, this is the illegal drug, this one, not the one that makes me puke and get in fights and all that. This one, this is the bad one. But I still kind of held out a little bit because I was like, all right, well, let's see how the rest of the night turns out. And, we were silly and we laughed and we ate a whole bunch of junk food, I'm sure. And then the next morning got up and nothing. So like, no hangover, no police reports. I mean, it was fine. And from that moment on, I kind of like my alcohol drinking went down and my marijuana use went up and my life got nothing but the better for it. But that was about 1990. I was still playing music. I had a computer IT career for a while. And it was just a personal thing. I didn't see any politics in it because, well, as you can tell from my background here, I'm from Idaho. Where we have 2 strains, got some and don't. So there's not like really a whole political thing around it. It was everybody keep your head low, and maybe a guy. So fast forward up into the 2000s, I get married. I end up moving to Portland, Oregon. Well, Portland's like the opposite of Boise, Idaho, as far as getting political and as far as cannabis being a political thing. And the giants were in their full stride by the time I got there. Your Paul Stanford, your John Sajos, Todd McArea farther south down in California, but that whole Jack Harrer, for God's sake, that whole Oregon marijuana initiative group from 1986 on that had kept on working, they were in full effect by the time I got to Portland. Get to 2005, I attended the Global Cannabis March, and I happened upon a woman named Anna Diaz, who was a reader of my Radical Russ blog. And this was, 2005, back in the day when blogs were a thing. And she introduced me to Madeline Martinez, the head of Oregon NORML. And from that point on, it was just it became my life. Cannabis activism just became my full-time vocation, my life's work, if you will. With Madeline, I co-starred on the Oregon NORML Presents a TV show. I actually ended up, associate producing that show. We ended up producing many iterations of the Oregon Medical Cannabis Awards, a medical flower judging competition, which was really unique. And I know they've come a long way since, but back in the day, most of these judging competitions were pretty much, guys who knew other guys, judging each other's cannabis. But we had come up with a whole rating system and double blind barcoding, so nobody knew whose strains were which. And it was really intricate. We did those sorts of things. We did hemp fashion shows. And what I'm most proud of our work with Oregon NORML was our patient access meetings. Again, this was back in the early 2000s when a number of these Western states had figured out we need to let patients have medical cannabis. And then the next logical question is, where do they get it from? And what, the pot fairy is supposed to show up, I guess, right? So we had a lot of these sick and disabled people, and especially, folks who would come into it because of their illness, who hadn't been marijuana smokers before, who don't know the guy. So we provided a meeting, once a month where these patients could show up, show their medical marijuana card. Wonderful, generous growers would offer starts, would offer medicine. Everybody left with a plant and an ounce, or as close to an ounce as we get. Sometimes it was 28 grams, 14, even 7 grams, but whatever we could do. And that's the way the community came together to provide access to the plant medicine for patients back in the day. And this is the early 2000s. Medical marijuana is legal, but you had to grow it yourself. If someone else grew it for you, you could only reimburse them for their expenses. You couldn't reimburse them for labor. It was still illegal to grow if you weren't medical. So there was still busts happening in the Rogue Valley, Applegate Valley, all these Southern Oregon growing areas. As we continued to work with Oregon NORML, as luck would have it, I entered a contest. It was a national talk radio contest to find the next great progressive talk radio star. They wanted like the left-wing Rush Limbaugh. And out of 500 nationwide competitors, I ended up winning the dang thing. And I won it with part of my final presentation being about the war on drugs. And this was at the tail end of the George W. Bush administration. So we were still at a point where marijuana legalization wasn't supported by a majority, where there was not even yet a legalized state. There'd been 2 or 3, Colorado, Nevada, that had tried to legalize and failed with like 48, 46, 44% of the vote. So it still wasn't a mainstream thing back then. And I was actually coached against including it in my final presentation because they said, oh, this drug stuff, it's not going to resonate. But I actually think I won the competition because of that. And thanks to that competition, I got a talk radio show on XM satellite radio for it lasted about 20 months. But that experience is what propelled me into working for National NORML. They had a daily podcast called The Daily Audio Stash, hosted by Chris Goldstein, and he was stepping down and they needed someone to take it over. And at that time, I was just beginning with Oregon NORML to attend the National NORML meetings, and they were looking for someone with radio experience, computer experience, who knew about marijuana. And never before had a job been so perfectly tailored to me. On my 40th birthday in 2008, I began my career as NORML's podcaster. And I did that for 4 years. Back in the days when you told people you had a podcast and their first question was, what's a podcast? Nowadays, pretty much everybody's got a podcast. Farmer Tom's got a podcast. So, but these again were the very pioneering days. 2008 through 2012, I worked for National NORML as their chapter outreach coordinator, traveled all across the country, met so many great NORML chapters and activists out there. 2012 went independent, had my own independent, the Russ Belville Show, partially because, while I talk about marijuana legalization, cannabis legalization, to me, it's a bigger subject than that. The founder of NORML, Keith Stropp, often explained to me that marijuana just is the placeholder for what the battle's about, and that is personal liberty, personal freedom. What business is it of the government or your neighbors what you're doing behind closed doors with yourself or other consenting adults? So as my politics got a little broader than cannabis, I'd start talking about mushrooms and ayahuasca and peyote, and start talking about even broader than just the drug issue. I felt it was better that, I should move on and just do myself rather than try to shoehorn what I was doing into what NORML would want. So began the Russ Belville Show in 2012. That went for about 4 years to about 2016. I began a news service called the Marijuana Agenda which I did for about a year and a half, a podcast. It served up little news bites that could be used in other people's podcasts. And that pretty much sums up the activism career. I ended up traveling the country, speaking at a lot of places. I debated Kevin Sabet once, covered the UN. It's just amazing what some interest in cannabis and a lot of hard work will get for you. And then fast forward finally to 2018, I left the broadcasting activism world. Kind of, after talking about it for a decade, there is a little burnout factor. Plus, we're kind of at a point now where I feel like I won the argument. Like when I began talking about this, 1 out of 3 people thought marijuana ought to be legal. When I retired doing it, 2 out of 3 people thought marijuana ought to be legal. Nowadays, when you argue for marijuana legalization, when you're arguing against somebody, it almost feels like they're like a flat earther. Like somebody doesn't believe the earth is round. It's like, it's so obvious now. Even Republicans support marijuana legalization. So I got into running a cannabis bed and breakfast, a Delta 9 house in Portland. I also ran the Delta 9 cabins in Sumter, Oregon. I was a assistant manager and IT specialist for a dispensary up in Sumter, the Coffee Pot.